Shout to the Lord, all the earth, let us sing. Power and majesty, praise to the King. Mountains bow down and the seas will roar at the sound of your name. I sing for joy at the work of your hands. Forever I'll love you, forever I'll stand. Nothing compares to the promise I have in you. Mi Cristo, mi Salvador, nadie es como tú. Y toda mi vida quiero exaltar las maravillas de tu amor. Consuelo, refugio, torre de fuerza y poder, todo mi ser, lo que yo soy, nunca cesará orar. Canta al Señor toda la creación, honra y poder, majestad sean rey. Montes caerán y el mar rugirá al sonar de tu nombre. Canto con gozo al mirar su poder. Por siempre yo te amaré y viviré. Incomparables promesas me das. Send shout to the Lord, all the earth, let us sing. Power and majesty, praise to the King. Mountains bow down and the seas will roar at the sound of your name. I sing for joy at the work of your hands. Forever I'll love you, forever I'll stand. Nothing compares to the promise I have. Ain't nothing compares to the promise I have. Ain't nothing compares to the promise we have in you.
Give me a moment. I'm really looking forward to the opening of this message. And it's because I get to go back to 1972. October 12th, 1972, I gave my life to Jesus Christ. And when I did, I became part of what was actually already in progress, a movement. And it was called the Jesus Movement, and the youth group that I was a part of but didn't participate with had gone to Dallas, Texas to hear Billy Graham and Explo 72. And what they came back with was something alive and something powerful and something real, and they had something that I didn't have, and so it was that fall that I gave my life to Jesus Christ, when I saw a difference in the lives of the young people. And that's why I'm excited when I hear about our young people getting ready to go to a camp. That there are life-changing events that take place at these occasions, these events. And I hope that you supported them not only in the church, but also in prayer this week while they're gone. I just pray that they will be on your hearts, on your minds, and in your prayers. I found a picture from that day, back in 1972. I don't know how many of you have ever seen this picture before. It was drawn, or the portrait was done by Richard Hooke, and for the longest time it was just the Hooke painting of Jesus. They used it in so many different ways to try to make it a part of the Jesus movement, and it was so meaningful to me that I was at the Baptist bookstore one day and I found a pocket-sized copy of it. And some of you remember, some of you men I know for sure, remember when your wallets had accordion like places where you put pictures. You had your sweetheart's picture, and hopefully your wife's, and you would fill it with pictures and children and things. I put that picture of Jesus in my wallet, and I was that enamored with what my newfound faith was about. Well, I tell you that to tell you this. One day I was in Memphis, and I was trying to make a purchase, and I had to write a check. And back in the day when they were requiring 2 forms of identification, I had a driver's license, but I didn't have a credit card, and I didn't even have a voter's registration yet. I wasn't quite 18. I didn't have anything. Some people used hunting license. I didn't have a hunting license. And so I had opened up my wallet and pulled out that accordion of cards that I had. Didn't know if a library card would work or not. But I was pulling out all these cards, or pulling out that to see if I had anything that would serve as a second form of identification. When the clerk saw that picture in my wallet, she looked at me and smiled and she said, "Do you know him?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "That's good enough for me." Jesus was my second form of identification to get a check approved in Memphis back in the early 1970s. Now, not many people can tell you that story, but that was the picture. Because when Jesus came into my life, He changed everything. And the title of the message this morning is simply that: Jesus changes everything. And if you'll open your Bibles to Acts chapter 9, we will read the story of how He changed everything for a man named Saul. While you're turning, let me just give you the background and kind of catch you up to where we are in our study in the book of Acts. A few weeks ago, we looked at the stoning of Stephen, which really marked the turning point of the story of Acts. In Acts chapter 8, verse 1, things just all began to change. We remember that in Acts 1:8, Jesus had told everybody, all of His disciples, "You will be my witnesses," and He gave them the directions in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the othermost parts of the earth. But it wasn't until Acts 8:1 that they ever got out of Jerusalem because of the stoning of Stephen in chapter 7. We saw that story, and we saw how that took place, and then we saw Philip, who went to Samaria, and how he experienced the revival in Samaria, and so many were coming to faith in Christ that Peter and others came from Jerusalem to confirm the expansion of the gospel to that next area of that Great Commission: Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria. We saw just a couple of weeks ago the gospel received by an Ethiopian eunuch, who then in turn carried it to another country. Christianity was on the move, and it was moving rapidly. But then so was persecution. As we're discovering, especially this week, I don't have to remind you of the news and the climate of our country on this particular weekend, but the news that we received of the overturning of Roe versus Wade was just a tremendous, tremendous announcement for those of us who value human life and every life that matters. We rejoice with the court's decision, but there's a whole lot of people who didn't, and a whole lot of people who don't. And what we are discovering is that Christianity is tolerated as long as we're tolerant of sin. But once we begin to confront sin, that toleration ends. And as such, we are going to start to see the onslaught of persecution, I think, particularly over this matter. But once it begins to confront sin or morals or traditions, The world says to itself, it needs to be silenced, and that is Acts chapter 9. You come to Acts chapter 9, and what we find is that the religious leaders who didn't understand Stephen and had put him to death, they actually thought they were acting on God's best interest. Perhaps maybe the important, significant part of the story from Acts chapter 7 is the last couple verses. And let me just share them with you again to remind you that when the Sanhedrin got so overwhelmed with the things that Stephen was saying, they literally cried out with a loud voice, stopped their ears, and ran at him with one accord. They cast him out in the city, and they stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. Now, before this story, we know virtually nothing about this man. But fortunately, not only from the book of Acts, but also from the letters that he wrote, we have learned some things. Paul will share of his story, not only in the book of Acts, but he'll share it from his letters. We know from Acts 21 he was multilingual. Just as my daughters sang in English and Spanish this morning in that song of praise. And if you didn't recognize the second stanzas that they were doing, it's because you don't know Spanish very well. But Saul also was multilingual. He spoke to the crowds in Hebrew, he spoke Aramaic, and he wrote letters in Greek. He was also, according to Acts 22, a Roman citizen. He was born in a Jewish family in the city of Tarsus. Now, Tarsus was a province of Cilicia, and although he was a Jew, his birth in the city granted him dual citizenship, and this is due to the fact that Tarsus's designation was referred to as a free city of Rome, so he was a Roman citizen, and he will use that in his travels in the book of Acts. He was also a Jew of the highest credentials. In the book of Philippians, and I know we haven't quite started there at Acts, but let me just share with you from Philippians chapter 3 that Paul writes, though I also might have confidence in the flesh. If anyone else thinks he has confidence in the flesh, I have more. Here's his credentials. Circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, concerning the law of Pharisee. Now what that means is that circumcised the 8th day, it was the mark of Israel given to Abraham, carrying all the rights and privileges of being from the stock of Israel. As tribe of Benjamin, this too was significant. Do you remember who Israel's first king was? His name was also Saul. Do you know what tribe he was from? He was from the tribe of Benjamin. I suspect that King Saul is the Saul of Tarsus's namesake. Being also from the same tribe, they named him after that great king that they had. And in fact, Benjamin went on so that when the northern tribes had been scattered by the Assyrians in their exile, Benjamin voluntarily relocated and joined Judah until Judah was then carried off to Babylon. In fact, Jerusalem, the beloved city of the Jews, the capital city, was built on land that had been donated by the tribe of Benjamin. So Saul had a pretty good pedigree. He said he was a Hebrew of Hebrews. That means he was trained and educated in the Torah. And that he was a Pharisee, which means he knew the oral law as well. He had as much Bible as anybody could have. Concerning zeal, it says in the next verse, he was persecuting the church. Now that was the misunderstanding. They thought that it was zealous or enthusiastic to persecute the church. He said, concerning righteousness, which was of the law, I was blameless. It's that last attribute of persecuting the church that we find the story in Acts chapter 9. Brings us to our story today. Look with me beginning at verses 1 and 2. Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest. And what they did was they asked letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if Saul, found any who were of the way, and we talked about this before, the way was the name of the church at that time. Those who gathered in the name of Jesus Christ, Jesus' followers, were called people of the way. And he was given letters that if he might find any who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. That was his mission. That was his quest. That was his purpose. And he was a man of determination. He set on destroying this new religious sect called the Way that in his heart and mind threatened Judaism. He's authorized here by the highest religious leaders of the Sanhedrin to silence Christianity. He takes his mission seriously, relentlessly, and he will imprison anybody that he finds along the way. In short, folks, Saul was a dangerous man. He was a dangerous man, and the people knew it. Read a little bit further, verse 3. As he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. And then he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Jesus himself appears to Saul in the form of light, the glory of God. I mean, in fact, it's the same light that appeared when God said, let there be light. When we have our Vacation Bible School day camp, we're going to have, I'm going to be working with Amy. We're going to have a group from 3rd to 6th graders, and we're going to talk to them about those days of creation. And I have reminded you on several occasions that day 1, God said, let there be light. What was that light? That light was the glory of God himself. He was saying, I will be known. It's the same light that appeared when Moses spoke to God face to face. And as a result, Moses' face shone from the reflection of the brightness of the glory of God. It's the same light that went before Israel in the wilderness. And it will be the same light that will illuminate the temple of heaven in the book of Revelation. This was Saul's encounter with Jesus. And his encounter was with the genuine nature of the Son of God with his glory. Now, up to this time, only Peter, James, and John had seen the glory of the Lord, and they saw that on the Mount of Transfiguration. Now Saul sees the glory, and it's interesting what takes place next. Because before he traveled on the road to Damascus, Paul could see, but he was blind to who Jesus really is. After his experience, his conversion on the road to Damascus, Saul was left blind, but now he could see who Jesus really is. Notice that when Saul persecuted the church, he's persecuting the body of Christ, and that's why he's guilty of persecuting Jesus himself. Saul knows he's in front of the Lord. In fact, if you look at verse 5, it says, he said, who are you, Lord? Then the Lord Jesus made it perfectly clear. I am Jesus. I'm the one you are persecuting. When you persecute my people, you're persecuting my body. When you persecute my body, you are persecuting me. I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. And then he makes a very interesting question to Saul. He says, it's not even really a question. It's not, is it hard? It's a statement. It is hard for you. You're making it hard on yourself when you resist me. That's what kick against the goads means. Saul thought he was persecuting an idea. He thought he was persecuting a system of beliefs or a religious movement. In reality, he was persecuting the very God he claimed to be serving. We look around us today, that's the blindness of persecution. The blindness of persecution is that you fail to see the object of your persecution for what it may really be. If they saw the truth of what they were opposing, they wouldn't oppose it. I find it ironic that the atheist who swears there is no God will eventually find himself cursing the God that he says doesn't even exist. You know what I think that makes him? Same thing David thought it made him, a fool. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Saul was thrashing out at people of the Messiah that he denied and was simply hurting himself. That expression, kick against the goads, it's resisting the direction of God. The goads is that stick that is used to prod cattle and animals along so that they go in the direction that you want them to go in. It's got a pointy end to it. And I've got a couple of cows on my property, and I've used sticks to try to get them in that direction sometimes. And if they kick against it and they kick against that pointed part of the stick, they're just going to hurt themselves. That's what this is a picture of. You're resisting God directing you, and as a result, you're hurting yourself. So what did Saul do? He humbled himself. He said, "Oh, Lord, what do you want me to do?" Verse 6, trembling, astonished, he humbles himself and he says, "Lord, what do you want me to do?" Have you ever come to that point in your life? Have you ever come to that point in your life where you've just turned to God and said, "Lord, what do you want me to do?" You see, that's the crucial test. That we go from doing what we want to do to what the Lord wants us to do. And at this point, he's humbling himself, and that's when salvation comes, when we humble ourselves. We discover the grace of God that's trying to lead us to the place where we truly need to be. His will more than our poor decisions. His ways more than our consistent failures. His life more than the existence we find ourselves settling for. And then turn around and complain to our friends how bored I am. Are you bored? Jesus can make life exciting. That's what I learned at the age of 15. That's what I learned when I saw a bunch of young people who had someone I didn't have. Not just something I didn't have. They had someone I didn't have. So Saul's conversion was made complete when he submitted to the lordship and he said, "What do you want me to do?" And the Lord said to him, "I'll tell you what I want you to do. Arise, go into the city, and you'll be told what you must do." And so in that humility and faith, he did pretty much what Philip did when God told Philip, "Arise, go into the desert, and I'll show you who I want you to talk to." Told to get up and go, he got up and went. It was made complete when he submitted to the lordship and was led at that point physically blind into the city. You know what? He soon found himself in the hands of a man that he would have arrested and hauled off to prison for his faith had he still not had that conversion experience. But Jesus doesn't just make a better you. He makes a new you. And when he makes a new you, Jesus changes everything. If Saul's encounter with Jesus teaches us anything, it's that we become a new creation in Christ. Jesus, by the way, as we'll continue in this story, not only changed Saul that day, he changed Ananias. Look at verse 10. Drop down a little bit further. There was a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias, and to him the Lord said in a vision, "Ananias?" And he said, "Here I am, Lord." Ananias was a Christ follower. He was available to God. His willingness is heard in his reply, "Here I am, Lord." And I'll tell you something, that's all Jesus really wants to hear from you. When he calls you to be engaged in something, when he calls you to be a part of something, he's not waiting for you to say, "Who, me?" He's waiting to hear you say, "Here I am." And when you say, "Lord," you've already presumed that you will be in agreement with whatever he says next. Look a little further, verse 11. So the Lord said to him, "Arise and go to the street called Straight, and inquire at the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus. For behold, he is praying. And in a vision he has seen a man named Ananias coming in, putting his hand on him so that he might receive his sight." You know, when God sets up an appointment, we saw this with Philip. When God sets up an appointment, he prepares both sides. Saul was looking for a man named Ananias. That's what Jesus told him to do. Ananias was now sent to a man named Saul. When God works, he works at both ends. Something I think I've also learned in the past few months is that God prepares both sides. And I have learned, and I've even had the opportunity to share with some, God's got this. This is under control. It's under His control, and He's taking care of both sides. God's will is never directed to us one-sidedly. Now, even though he knew that he was supposed to go and that he was supposed to receive his sight, and he knew that God was in this, I think Ananias still had some reservations at first because he recognized that name, Saul of Tarsus. And in his back of his mind, he said, but this man is dangerous. Look what he says in verse 13. Ananias answered, Lord, I've heard from many about this man, how much harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here in Damascus, he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who call on your name, and I'm one of those. God's got this. I think it's helpful for Ananias in verse 15. You can see it in your Bible that the Lord said to him, no, go. Go. It's okay. Go. I've got this. Go. For he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, which hadn't been done yet, kings, which hadn't been done yet, and the children of Israel. But then he adds verse 16. I think this is significant and helpful for Ananias. He says, for I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake. He's done a lot of he's caused a lot of suffering up to this point. But Ananias, if you'll be in on this, I'll show Saul the things that he will need to suffer. I think Ananias may have been a little relieved that he wasn't the one who was going to have to suffer for Jesus' sake today. At least not this time. But there was still that possibility. So what made Ananias go? What sent Ananias to a street called Straight to inquire a man named Saul? Well, I'll tell you what it took. It took dying to self, and that changes us. See, not only was God in the process of changing Saul, He was in the process of changing Ananias and saying, you can trust me for anything I command you to do because I'll give you the grace to see it through. Like Philip told to get up and go, he got up and went. Look at verse 17. Ananias went his way, entered the house. Laying his hands on him, he said, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you came, has sent me that you may receive your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. Now, don't get too caught up in that as some kind of mystical experience. What does it mean to be filled with the Holy Spirit? Controlled. To be controlled by the Holy Spirit. Not only would Saul, and he probably has already been a recipient of the Holy Spirit. Why? Because Ananias greets him by saying, Brother Saul. He's already a believer when Ananias gets there. Note that Ananias baptizes Saul, but he calls him Brother Saul before he baptizes him. Saul became Brother Saul when he believed and received Jesus as Lord and Savior, and so do you and I. If you look at verses 18 and 19, you'll see immediately there fell from his eyes something like scales, and he received his sight at once, and he arose and was baptized. He was not baptized until after Ananias showed up. And when he had received food, he was strengthened, and Saul spent some days with the disciples of Damascus. In a spiritual sense, he once was blind, now he could see. The recovery of his sight, though, is important. But the recovery of his sight was not his salvation. Mark it down. Healing doesn't bring salvation. Baptism doesn't bring salvation. Jesus brought salvation. And he brought it to Saul, and he changed everything. So that when he received his food, he was strengthened. He spent some days with the disciples at Damascus, and not only did Ananias get his mind and heart changed, so did these other disciples. They saw a different Saul. Have your friends and family seen a different you? Has there been a time when in your life, your life was so touched by Jesus that He changed what you were into what He wants you to be? And now as you are growing, and as you are finding that areas of submission and of your will to His will, your ways to His way, that people who knew you then are saying to you now, what has gotten into you? And you just get to smile and say, it's not what, my friend? It's who? Jesus has gotten into me. And Jesus changes everything. The story ends much different than it began. Do you remember how it began? It began in verse 1, then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. Look how it ends. Immediately, he preached the Christ in the synagogues. The very Christ that he was arresting people for receiving and becoming a part of the way. He says, now, I'm one of you. And he preached the Christ in the synagogues. What? That he was the Son of God. And by the way, folks aren't quite used to Saul yet. All who heard were amazed, and they said, is this not he who destroyed those who called on this name in Jerusalem? And has he not come here for that very purpose, to put us in prison? Something has happened. Something has changed. And that something is Jesus. Saul increased all the more in strength. And here's the irony. He confounded the Jews who he thought he was following. He confounded the Jews who dwelt in Damascus, proving that Jesus Christ is the Lord. He went from confronting believers on behalf of the Jews to confounding the Jews on the behalf of their Jesus, who, by the way, was now his Jesus. I showed you that picture this morning because I wanted you to meet my Jesus. This is the one that I came to think of when I gave my heart and life to Jesus. How could Saul have made that kind of change? Simple. Jesus changes everything. So I ask you this morning, has this Jesus changed your everything? Let's pray.